All right, Luke chapter 8. Luke chapter 8. Luke chapter 8. It's a very familiar passage. But I'm gonna give you guys a little different view on it today. I've only talked about this one other time, and it was, I don't know, when I found this, I just thought, man, I'm so glad God gave it to me when he did. Luke chapter 8, we're going to read in verse 4, and we'll go down to verse number 8. It's not much. He says, "And when much people were gathered together and were come to him out of every city, he spake by a parable. It says, a sower went out to sow his seed, and he sowed. Some fell by the wayside, and it was trodden down, and the fowls of the air devoured it. And some fell upon a rock, and as soon as it was sprung up, it withered away because it lacked moisture. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up with it and choked it. And other fell on good ground and sprang up and bare fruit, an hundredfold. And when he had said these things, he cried, He that hath an ear, let him hear." So I'm going to pray real quick, and then we'll get started. Dear Heavenly Father, we do thank you for this morning. We thank you for the opportunity. It is always an honor and a privilege to be here, Lord, and we love this little church already. We thank you for all the people that came out today, and it is good to feel the Spirit of God in this place. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, we've all heard the story. We've all heard the parable about the seed. But I want to give you guys just a little bit of a different view today. So when I read this, I've read and I study, and I've always been taught the law of first mention in the Bible. Okay, it's just you usually want to, when you read, you always look for the first time or the first thing that's mentioned, and it kind of gives you your subject or your a lead into what's coming. So when you read this through, right, and we see he spake a parable, and then he starts his parable. He starts off with a sower. We've always read this, and we've always studied the seed, right? We've always read about the seed and the different seeds, and we all where they go. But I want to give you guys maybe an alternate idea on this, and look at it from the viewpoint of the sower. We, biblically speaking, are sowers. We are to be the ones that are spreading the word, right? We are, as it's awfully said, we are the sheep, and we have a shepherd. We have the shepherd, but we also have a shepherd here in the church. It's the pastor. But I've never seen a shepherd produce sheep. It's always sheep that produce sheep. Shepherds don't produce sheep. That'd be weird. Shepherds do, or sheep do. Sheep produce more sheep. So we, as the flock, should be producing. We should be getting and sowing and finding more sheep. We should be talking. Our pastor says it all the time. We should always be doing ministry. There is nobody, and you should not need a title. You should not need to be told you're a Sunday school teacher. You're this, you're that. You need to go out on Saturdays, and we're going to make a visitation schedule. And that's always a good thing. That's not a bad thing. But what he says is ministry should be done all the time by everybody. You're always in ministry. The moment you leave your house, the moment you wake up, you're in the ministry. You're in the ministry of telling other people all the time. So anywhere we go, we always try to tell people. But here we see the sower. You're the sower. So this is about you. Think about that for a second. So my wife, one thing being on 4.5 years of chemo will do is it messes your brain. It's called chemo brain. If you don't hear about it, you get things messed up all the time. So I'm constantly calling her different things. So my wife, I'll get it right that time. She grew up in the country, and her dad was what we'd call a hobby farmer. And I grew up in the city. I was lucky if I had a garden. And we always had gardens, but I did not know farm life. I was not really, I knew what a farm was. I knew we had crops came from farms, and I knew all that. But I had never really experienced a farm. So when we were starting to date and we were courting and stuff, I was always going out to her house. And while I was driving, or anywhere we went after we were together, because we always had her parents or her brother with us as chaperone, we would drive through all the farm fields. I mean, they were everywhere, hundreds of acres. And I would see things and I would ask questions, and because I didn't really understand everything. And as I was more and more in the country, I learned more and more how farms operated, how farm fields worked, why there was a giant pile of rocks in the middle or on the side, and where I learned all this stuff. And I didn't really click until, it clicked, but I as I read this one time, I was reading through this, and I realized there's a lot in here that has to do with you and I as the sower, and not so much the seed. And I started reading it, and I started learning and going back into what I had remembered and what I had learned about farming. And one thing I can say this is in this passage, this sower, we don't know if he was given a field. We don't know if he inherited this field. We don't know how long he's had this field. We just know he has a field. So let's just assume for a second, because it's okay to do that. We're gonna have our imagination. We're gonna play a little bit. We're gonna say, what if he was new? What if he bought the piece of property and he decided, I'm gonna be a farmer? He did not just go out and start sowing. It don't work that way. In Michigan, when you buy a piece of property and you want to start a farm, it does not look like a farm. In fact, it looks nothing like a farm. It looks a whole lot like woods. And what would happen is you'd have to start at some point clearing that piece of property. And you'd have to get there and you have to start pulling out all the trees, and you'd have to start taking everything off it and cutting it all down. And if you notice something in a farm, there's always a 2-track or a worn area where they always run their tractors. Whether they're going around their field to get to another field, or they're going to a certain area of that field, or they're going back to the barn, they don't generally run right through the middle of the cornfield. That would be kind of counterproductive. If you took your tractor right through your freshly grown corn, you'd destroy a lot of your corn. So you're not going to do that. You're not going to do it any kind of crop, really. So there's always, at some point, when you start, imagine, when I did this just recently at our church. And I went out and I got a big 4x8 sheet of plywood, and I built a farm out of, my hobby, I used to be trains, so I know how to build train sets and the landscaping. So I built a field, and I went and bought the barns, and I just built the whole thing, and I laid it out in front of the whole church. And I dressed like Farmer John that day. I wore my overalls, and I showed them how when you start working a field, you end up creating a 2-track around your field, because a lot of times you want to go observe your field, you want to drive around it, you're going to watch it, you're going to make sure there's nothing wrong on a daily basis, whether you're in a truck or you're in a side-by-side or a four-wheeler, whatever it is. Back then it was probably a horse-drawn carriage, but whatever it was, they would go around their fields and constantly watch. And that farmer, notice the first part of this. He said, some fell by the wayside. Now, when you have a field, you've got your good soil, right? You got where you plow constantly and cultivate, right? And then you're going to have your 2-track that goes all the way around that field. Now, mind you, that 2-track, when he first started, it didn't look like that. But it took a lot of time, a lot of years, a lot of going over and over and over, running over it back and forth all the time to create what we would call a 2-track, or we'll call a road, whatever you want to call it. Okay? And that's right next to your cultivated property. And it says that seed fell on the wayside. The word literally explains what that is. It is on the side. Wayside. Your 2-track is next to your cultivated field. That is your wayside. That 2-track that you create by running the same thing over and over all the time, constantly going, it's you've created that. So this spot where the sower sowed and some of that seed fell, he created. He created that wayside. And what is that? What is that? How does that apply to us today? So the first thing today is when you talk about your wayside, that is to us, that's the people we see every day. That's your family members, your neighbors, your coworkers, the people that you interact with all the time. And because you have either through embarrassment or just because you're afraid of what they might think or just a lack of maybe understanding and knowing how, you have failed to share with them the gospel. And because you have seen them over and over and over again, when the time comes where you finally do spread that seed and it lands on them, they say, why didn't you tell me about this before? You know, if it took you this long to tell me about Christ, it must not have been important enough for you to tell me back here. So I'm sorry, but I have no interest in it now. You didn't care enough to tell me here, so why should I care enough to listen to you now? It's the same people that we take for granted. We take for granted our neighbors. Why? Because we see them every day. We take for granted those that we work next to every day. Because why? We've gotten so used to them being there. We've gotten so used to our family reunions and seeing Uncle Joe and Aunt Martha or me. Well, all these people. You see them all the time. You've just gotten so used to seeing them that you just don't think about it anymore. And when finally the time comes where you get to sow a seed, it doesn't do any good. Because you've created that wayside. You've created it because from the very beginning, you didn't bother to tell about something that you should have told them about, and that was Christ. That seed could never take root now. It says that the fowls of the air come by and devour it. The world devours them because you didn't bother to share it with them back here. So you've created the wayside. That farmer created that. The sower created that place where that seed couldn't take root. So let's continue. Let's look at verse 6. And some fell upon a rock. Okay. Now, I can honestly say I've seen this. When you're plowing a field, when they first plow a field, the first thing they do is not plow the field. They'll actually take and they'll walk it. You'll see them out in the springtime in Michigan, right after the thaw, and it's real muddy usually because the snow melted and it's just nasty. And they'll be out there and they'll take before it was walking, now it's four-wheelers or side-by-sides because we're too lazy to walk that far. But they'll walk and they'll take and they'll remove all the rocks from the field. And you're saying, why do they have to do that every year? Well, believe it or not, the ground will push up more rocks every year. It'll keep pushing them up. So even though you take out some one year, more will appear the next year. That's just how it works. And so you have to go and take out those big rocks. And where do you put them? If you ever look at a field, when you're in Michigan, you'll see it. Some of them are so big you can't see the other side, so that's why you don't see it. But in Michigan, some of them are small enough you can see it. Either along the side or sometimes even in the middle of the field, there's a giant pile of rocks. Because nobody wants to carry those rocks very far. So them farmers will take them and they'll start stacking those rocks somewhere to get them out of the field. Because let me tell you something. When you're running $1.5 million John Deere and you're pulling $1 million cultivator behind it, the last thing you want to do is hit a rock. Okay? Trust me. It ain't easy to fix them things, and they're very costly. So they make sure they clear the rocks before they cultivate that field. So here we see it fell upon the rock. Makes me wonder, did the sower make that pile of rocks? The sower had to create that pile of rocks. He took them out of what he was considered his field, his area of ministry, and he took out the rocks that were going to cause problems. Do you realize, though, as Christians, sometimes we have to go through our field and we have to remove things that cause us problems? You have to. There are things in your life as a Christian, and each of us is all different. Every one of our what sometimes people call them pet sins, but things that we struggle with. And sometimes you have to learn just to remove that problem. And you got to remove not only that problem, but all the other problems that pertain to that problem. Because it's just easier to not have the temptation, right? So we have things in our lives as Christians we have to take out. If you can't handle, and I'm not saying this I know some Christians can't handle going, we know them. If you've had a problem and you came out of you got saved and you came out of having alcoholic problems and you no longer want to be around beer, you can't go to Applebee's. That's okay. Nothing on you. Good for you. That you know what you can't do. So you remove that problem from your life by saying, I'm just not going to go there. You all want to go. That's cool. I don't mind. You guys don't have that problem. I didn't have that issue. You want to go? Go ahead and go. I can't go. I know what my limitation is. My father-in-law came out of rock and roll music. He played the guitar so well. And he was that guy from Back to the Future when that kid stood in front of that stack of, speakers and that thing would blew the whole house apart. That was my father-in-law back in the day. He had those speakers in the basement. And he would play that and he'd rock out. To this day, he can't play an electric guitar. He plays acoustic just fine. He plays in church. He plays all the country songs, or country gospel. He plays the bluegrass gospel. He plays southern gospel. He cannot pick up an electric guitar. Because the moment he does, he starts, and he's like, whoa, it's in him. He can't get rid of that. So what he's done is he's decided, okay, I just won't have one. His son bought him one because he figured it had been long enough. It had been years. He thought he'd be, Dad, I'll buy you one finally. And it wasn't too long afterwards, he brought it to my house and said, here, why don't you just keep this? He just couldn't do it. He just found himself going back to something that he knew he shouldn't have had. And it just wore on him, and he couldn't do it. So he just gave up. He got rid of that rock and the rocks around him that were a problem. And he put it in a pile, and he said, I know I can't have this in my field. What if maybe we just get too busy with life? Maybe you're too busy. That's one thing. Kids' sports today has ruined a lot of things because there's no reason they have to play on Sundays. There's no reason they have to practice on Wednesdays. But they do. It seems like the one day they want to practice is Wednesday nights, and the one day they want to play is on Sundays. My daughter loves to play soccer. She played with a local Christian school last year, and that worked out really well for her. Of course, they didn't practice on Sundays, and they didn't play on Wednesdays, and they didn't play on Sundays. But then she's like, well, I liked playing for them, but I didn't like the coach, and I didn't like the coach either. And I didn't get enough play time, and all the players, and it just wasn't the best team. And it happens. So I started looking around. Where can I put her? She wants to play soccer. I looked at the Y. I looked into other clubs. And I could not find a team that did not practice or play on Wednesdays and Sundays. And I told her, I'm sorry. Church comes first. I grew up that same way. Church came first. I grew up in Michigan. If you grew up in Michigan, you're going to play one sport or another. Most of the time, you're going to play hockey because it's a cold state, and that's what we played. I still miss the cold weather to some degree. I don't miss the snow. I do miss the cold weather because with cold weather came certain things you can enjoy. Skiing, snowboarding, skating. You don't get that down here. I hope not, because that means snow came. But I played hockey. I played Little League for a while. I did basketball for a little while, but my heart was in hockey. I just loved the sport. So I played. And my dad would always go to the coach when we started the leagues, and he'd always tell him, we will not be there Wednesdays, and we will not be there Sundays, whether it's a game or a practice. And the coach said, well, okay, but I'm going to play the players that are here. My dad said, that's fine, we understand. What the coach didn't know was that even though I couldn't practice all those times, I was practicing all in between. And I was out working hard to be as good as I could be. And it always ended up that the coach always had to say, I don't want to play you, but if I don't play you, we don't win. So I have to play you. And they would always come back to bite the coach. Even though I couldn't be there on Wednesdays and Sundays, it just happened to work out that the coach ended up having to play me, because if he didn't, the other parents were like, why aren't you playing the best kid on the team? And he'd always say, well, he didn't show up for practice. They'd say, who cares? Play him. So I'd get to play, even though we didn't make all the practices. And it's okay, because you know what? At some point, you have to stand for right things, right? So as I got older, and I became my own adult, right, 18, 19, 20, 21, as I got to playing with other groups that weren't just kids' leagues anymore. So I was practicing with the University of Michigan hockey team. I was doing other things, and there came a point in my life as a young man, I had to decide for myself, what do I do? Because there was no way to avoid not playing on Wednesdays and Sundays. So there came a time where I walked away from the game, because I knew I had to take that rock and I had to remove it, because it was coming between me and what God wanted me to do. What is holding you back? What is stopping you from plowing that field and harvesting that field and sowing the seed in that field that you're supposed to have? Every one of us has a field. God gave us all some kind of field to work in. But what is holding us back from cultivating and plowing and using that field? It could be the rocks that you need to remove. There's probably something in our lives that we need to say, hey, if I just take this out, I could be so much more effective. All right, let's go to verse 6. No, that's where we were. Verse 7. It says, and some fell among thorns. The thorns sprang up and choked it. Here's another one. Here's the sower. The sower made his field. He cut all the trees down. He's got his wayside, unfortunately. He's done cleared all his rocks. He's done piled them in a pile. But there happens to be something in the middle of that field he just does not want to take the time to remove. And I've seen it. I have seen some oak trees in the middle of a field. They're so big, they don't want to take the time to remove them. Because by the time you cut them down and by the time you take the roots out, it's just not worth it for that little, 3-foot spot that tree took up. So what do? If you ever look at a field, you'll see like sometimes there's a tree, or sometimes there's an old house or an old shed or something in the middle. And now they'll go right up to it and then they'll plow around it. No point in destroying it. No point in going through it. We'll just go around it. That's okay. It works. It does work for a while. You can go around it, go around it, go around it. You know what happens after a while when you keep going around things? Eventually, if you don't own a weed eater, you'd know this. If you just keep mowing your grass with your mower and you never pull out a weed eater, eventually as you start going around your trees, they start to grow weeds stronger and longer and longer, right? Because you can't get the mower close enough. Same thing with a plow. If you're plowing around something constantly, things start to grow. And in this case, I know in Michigan, if you leave something alone long enough, you start getting a bunch of pickers and priors that grow up. And I mean the ones that just, man, we got some. They got this purple flower that grows at the end. What is that thing? A thistle, I think. Oh, man, them things got some pokers on them. And I thought they were bad until you all got down here and I found out what what's that one bush? Real colorful. Yeah, Bergenwood. Oh, good. Now y'all can have them suckers. Oh, I did landscaping for a while, and a guy called me. He's like, I need you to remove my bougainvillea in the back. I said, okay, no problem. And I got there, and this thing would have covered the whole front of the church. I'm like, whatever. I'd never removed one before, never. I got in there and I started chopping and, what was that? I mean, a tree would, anything would stick in you that long, And by the time I got done, I had more holes in me than, a pin cushion. I mean, I was stuck up so bad. And I didn't know that even if you stepped on one, they went through your shoes. So I had shoes. I still have the same shoes at home. I just don't wear them. Because if I wear them and I step wrong, I can still feel like little spikes in them. So they're just in my closet. But them things are nasty. But we got thistles and briars in Michigan too. And when you leave something alone long enough, they'll grow up. They love to be near flowers and they love to be near good soil. But they don't necessarily always grow in the good soil. They will grow in anything. And in the middle of that field sometimes you'll see they'll plow around a big tree. And then around that tree over time, you'll start to see it no longer looks nice because it's done growing up with a bunch of thistles and briars and pokers and everything else that you don't want to walk through. So here we see that. This guy ran into some thorns. Where were those thorns? Well, more than likely, if you're a farmer, the only place that thorns and thistles show up is not in your field. You're cultivating it and plowing it too much. They're not going to show up there. And you're spraying it too much with weed killer. Shouldn't do that, but they do it. They're not going to be there. The thistles and the briars are the places where that tractor avoids. Sometimes on the end, on the curves, they don't always get the same path on the turns. Sometimes the turns on the outside of the turn will grow some thistles and briars because they're not always able to hit the same path. Or sometimes right in the middle, they'll go around something because they don't want to deal with it. So they just go around it. The only place them thistles and briars show up is places that we want to avoid and we just don't want to deal with it. That's how we as Christians are. We get times in our lives where we'd just rather just not deal with something, and we just go, I'll just go around it. I'd rather just not deal with it. I know I've got a heart problem, God. I know I'm supposed to do this. I know I should be, pastors asked me to be a Sunday school teacher. I just hate kids. I don't want to deal with them. So we just say, I'm going to avoid it. I don't want to talk about it. I won't remind him about it, and I hope he forgets about it. And I'm going to avoid that. I just don't want to deal with it. So we go around it. It just ain't there. We'll ignore it. Or maybe, and I'm not saying y'all have this here, but maybe someone from this side doesn't like somebody from this side. And instead of dealing with it, we just ignore it. I'll just get over it. But you know what happens is that thistle and that briar starts to grow up. I'd just rather not. I just go around it. Why deal with it? Well, because the Bible says to. It says go to that person you have a problem with, right? What about man, I don't like the way the preacher said that. He stepped on my toes. I don't appreciate him talking about that. I'm not going to deal with it. Not going to deal with it. I'm just going to go around it. I'm going to go right around it. I'm going to act like it never happened. The problem is then when you start sowing seed, now you got to deal with it because some of them seed lands in that area. And it's never going to get, you could take it out. You could take the tree out. Them little buildings they go around sometimes, them old shacks or them old houses that look torn down, they could take the time to remove it if they wanted to. They just don't want to do the work. Sometimes we don't want to do the work. We'd rather just sit and not do the work. We'd rather ignore it and not do the work. I know we got a family that we know, and 5 kids, all within, well, whatever. Sometimes as parents, we have to do the work. When you have kids, it's your obligation to raise them. You got to do the work. You can't ignore it. Because when you start ignoring it, you start going around certain things you just don't want to deal with, then later on, it becomes a problem. Now you got to deal with it. You know, there's just things in our lives, just like this sower. The sower decided there was somewhere that he did not want to deal with. So instead of dealing with it, he just went around it. Or he didn't bother to cultivate it, or he didn't bother plowing it because he was either too lazy or it would take extra time. Maybe it'd slow him down in his work. Whatever reason, he left an area for thorns and thistles to grow. So he's out there, he's sowing. He's doing what he's supposed to do. He's got his field. He's out there sowing the seed. He's doing it by hand. Nowadays, we just ride a tractor, But he's throwing that seed, throwing it. It's like I used to do fertilizing and stuff on lawns. I'd run that fertilizer. And you try to adjust that thing where it wouldn't spread like 6,000 feet and cover the driveways and the sidewalks and all that. And you try to get that thing to spread less. Or they had that little attachment where if you put it in, it wouldn't spread this way, but it only spread that way. And you're trying to avoid getting it where it don't belong, right? and he's out there doing that, he's doing what God wanted him to do, work his field. And that's a good thing. You should. You should want to work your field. You should want to spread the seed. But the problem is he's created some areas where he doesn't want to deal with. He's created a wayside. He's created a pile of rocks where he can no longer grow any seed. He's created an area of thorns and thistles where the seed can't grow either. We as Christians do the same thing. We're just like that sower. We have our areas where it's fertile and it's where it's working. But the problem is God told us to go out and go to everybody. Go to all the world. Your Judeas, your Jerusalems, your Samarias, and the othermost parts of the earth. We're supposed to go and talk to everybody. There's not a single person on earth that doesn't deserve to know about Christ. But if we have thorns and thistles, and we have a pile of rocks, and we have a wayside, that means some of our seed is not reaching everybody. Now, you can take care of that. You can. You want to take care of a wayside? Plow it up. Plow it up. They don't plow a lot. Michigan, they only plow in Michigan if the ground is, like, after so many years of growing in it, it needs to be plowed, not cultivated. There's a difference. Plow will take and furrow that thing real deep, and it'll turn it over. And it's when they're doing it, it's just these giant, looks like almost like waves, like you all got in the ocean when they're driving. Looks like waves of dirt. And it's it takes a strong tractor to pull a big plow. And usually when they pull out, if you see them pull out of a barn and they're running that John Deere that's articulated and it's got the big treads on the sides and instead of tires, more than likely they're about to hook up to a plow because it takes a lot of power to pull a plow. And they're usually not very big. Plows only go maybe 10 or 12 rows at a time at the most because it takes so much power to pull that through and turn all that dirt over. And it's a tremendous, I mean, you're talking 500-600 horsepower just to turn that kind of dirt. And they'll turn that plow. So if you want to take a wayside, a 2-track someplace that's been over years, been packed and packed and packed, and you want to turn that over and make it growable again, it takes a lot of power and it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time as a Christian. If you want to take somewhere that's been ignored and you've got people that have already rejected the seed because you've sown it, but because you've been maybe lazy in your Christian life and you waited too long to witness to them, if you want to take that and you want to plow that over so you can fix it, it's going to take some prayer and lots of it. It's going to take a lot of time and consistency on your part of showing them the gospel and saying, I'm sorry, I messed up, but let me replow this. Let me work on it. Let me pull out and I'll harness the power of God. And I'll spend some time on my knees and I'll pray for you. And I'll pray and I'll pray and I'll pray that God allows me to turn that soil over so I can plant that seed again. You want to get rid of the rocks? It's going to take some effort. You've done piled up so many now. If they wanted to remove some of those piles of rocks that I've seen in Michigan, it would take some big equipment and it would take a lot of man hours because they got hundreds, if not thousands of rocks piled up. And I mean, some of them are boulders. But you can do it if you got the right amount of power. I prefer a nice cat to do it myself, but that's me. Get you a big old dozer in there and you can start lifting and get that power behind it. That comes from God. God can give you that ability, but you got to spend time with him. Got to spend time doing this, reading, studying. The Bible actually never says to read it. You ever found that? Someone find me a verse. You can't do it. The Bible actually never says just to read the Bible. It says to study the Word. That's different. I read my schoolwork. I was not a good, look, I admit it. I was not a good school kid, okay? I just didn't. I hated studying. I got by, and it's fine. I was a B and C student, and I know it. But I was not into studying. I hated studying. The worst subject I had was math. I hated math. Why do I need to know calculus? I have no plans on ever using it, and I still don't use it. And my dad, we would sit down, he'd get the whiteboard out, and we'd work it and work it and work it and work it. And I'd be like, oh, I'm so tired of finding X and Y. Please, let's move on. And I just wasn't me. And I hated studying. And I'd pass my test, but I just didn't enjoy it. I played you ever just, parents want you to do something, so you do it. They wanted me to play an instrument. Why? I had no interest in it. So they picked one. They picked a brass instrument. No, thank you. They picked a cornet. I don't know why, but they did. And I blew that thing for years. And I annoyed all our neighbors. And they even paid for private lessons. And it wasn't in my heart. I didn't study it. What I mean by that is I didn't practice enough to be good. I could still toot a few things today if I had to. I could show you some of the notes if I had to. I can't play you a song if my life depended on it. I just didn't study it enough. I didn't take time to learn. Now, with that being said, I was a fan of art. I was always an artist. And you didn't have to push me to practice my art. I went to church school, and they didn't really offer an art class in church school where I was at. So my parents put me in private classes, and I did art school outside of school. And I did that for 7 years, and all through middle school. And finally, our church offered an art class through our curriculum. We had 2 art classes. We had basic and advanced. He goes, which one do you want to do? I said, give me the advanced. Like, just don't even bother with the basic. He's like, okay. I got that class, and I started going through the book, and I'm like, I had 12 projects I had to finish, and all that. And like our school starts in September, right after Labor Day. Labor Day. I was through with all the entire curriculum by like end of October. And he's like, what was the point of doing the class? You literally knew it all. I said, I know. I just wanted to see if I could do it. I studied my art. I would go home when I was in middle school, and yeah, I blew on my trumpet sometimes, but the moment I got done blowing my trumpet, man, I was right to that art table. And I'd spent hours at the art table practicing my penciling and my black and white and my pastels and my chalk, and I practiced. I hated painting, believe it or not. I was not a painter, but I loved everything else. I could do black and white pencil with the best of them. I could do pen work. I could do chalk work. I used to do chalk work for our churches, and every time we'd have big activities, I'd do like entire wall of chalk work, and I loved that stuff. And I studied it, and I did the best I could at it because I loved it. If you love this book, you'll study it, and you'll get as good as you can possibly get at knowing it. And that way, when the day comes like I did, where I got to do a class and it was advanced, I flew right through it as if it wasn't anything. It wasn't hard at all because I knew what I was doing. When you know this book, when that time comes to sow that seed, and that time comes to replow something that needs replowed, and it time comes to, you'll know it so well. You will have no problem. Yeah, let me tell you about God. Let me tell you what Christ did for me. Let me tell you what He's done, what God's blessed me with. It's not hard for us. When we're out and about and we talk about our son, and I do appreciate the pastor showing our son's funeral back in July when they streamed that here at the church. They shared our stream, and I appreciate that. But when we talk and we're out and about, we have no problem talking about that. We're right on top of it. Let me tell you what God did through him. Let me tell you what God's done for us. Let me tell you about the 2.5 years that we shouldn't have had that God gave us because the doctors don't have a clue what they were doing. But let me tell you what God did. I can go through that story, and I can tell you like this because I know it so well because we took enough time to know God. We knew our God. We knew what He would do for us. There was a lot of times the doctors would walk in the office, into our room and say, "It don't look good. There's no way. There's no way. He's on his ventilator. There's no activity. There's nothing. Give him 3 days." You're wrong. I'm like, what do you mean we're wrong? You don't know who you're dealing with. You don't know who's on our side. And some of them, they got mad. They literally got mad at us because we doubted their ability as a doctor. And I remember we would start praying. We'd sing in there, and our church would come up, and our guys would come up, his friends, and they'd sing, and he'd be in there, and it was amazing. They'd have that all those tubes to his brain, right? All the lines, and they'd see the brain waves, and we'd get to watch all that. And we'd watch, and sometimes they'd have a lady in there watching too, and they'd say, it just doesn't look like anything's happening. All right. And then we'd start singing. Whatever song. He loved to sing any song. He loved all songs. Anything about God. We'd start singing, just Jesus Loves Me, or any kind of song we could think of. And that lady, she goes, listen, I don't know what's going on. I can't explain it. But when y'all start singing, things happen. But they shouldn't. But they do. Well, you don't know our God. And we'd get that Bible, and we'd read his Bible to him, and we'd read his Bible stories, and we'd read his devotions, and same thing. What is he doing? Well, he can't do that. He can't do that. That's not allowed. Well, it is. Whether you like it or not, he's doing it. And I remember in the middle of the night, whatever day it was the middle of the night, the ventilator tech, I think it was, wasn't it? He came in, and it was beeping and going off all crazy. Beep, beep, beep. We were so used to beeps, we didn't even care at that point. Yeah, he didn't have his chest vent yet. He had just intubated. And that thing was going off. We were so used to beeps and everything by then. When you hear it your whole life, you just get used to it. And that thing was going off, and he comes in, and he's trying to figure out why it's beeping, and, it was because there was no airflow or whatever coming through it. And we were, I think we were praying or reading, and all of a sudden he screams out of nowhere, help! And I'm like, what in the world, buddy? He's screaming, help, help, somebody get him in here, get in here. And what happened was our son, which if you know anything about intubation tubes, this doesn't happen, even with adults. The tube, he would have to have a bite plate in to keep him from, because he would bite on it. Well, he literally bit through the bite plate, and he bit through the tube. And it was dangling in his throat. And he woke up at that moment. He literally woke up. He's like, and that's how our son's always been. He always was like that. He didn't wait for the doctor's timing. He just did it he was ready for God's timing. And he decided, okay, I've been asleep long enough. I'm done. I'm going to wake up now. He woke up and he bit through his tube because he didn't want it in his throat anymore. And that had never happened, mind you. We were at Arnold Palmer Children down in Orlando. That has never happened. A child, let alone an adult, has never bit through their intubation tube. He did. He bit through that thing twice. He bit through it that night, and then they put him back on it a few days later to help him out, and he bit through it again. He just didn't want that tube in. So that's why we ended up getting him trached. He just needed, his lungs needed a little bit of help. He didn't want the help. His lungs wanted the help. And I remember the doctor that checked us in, I'll just finish with this story. The doctor that checked us in, she looked at us and she said, you need to sign the paper. Just sign the DNR. It's over. Take your 3 days. Basically is what she said. And we said, you don't know our God. She got mad at us and walked out of the office. She goes, I want nothing to do with you. Okay, it's fine. We have other doctors. And God gave us some great doctors afterwards. Every week, another doctor that came along, almost every one of them was a Christian and was right there with us and saying, we got this. We'll do everything we can. We understand what your thought process is. We're like, thank you. He came out of that. He came to. We went through, and we had the choice of putting a trach in, which in our Lish-Nyhan community was greatly frowned upon. So there's only 700-ish approximately kids that were like our son in the world. And we knew a lot of the parents, and there's a big group and whatever. And they found out that we were going to trach our son. And my wife got all kinds of messages. I mean, nastiest things you could write about it. And we're like, whatever, we just don't care. We've gotten to that point where we had our family. We had our church. We had our God. We didn't need anybody else. And we went through that whole process. Took 53 days from the time they flighted him in through the helicopter to the day we were able to wheel him out that day. Before we left, that doctor that checked us in came back in, got us in the hallway. We'd seen her in the hallway a few times, right? Hallway. She's seen us in the hallway. She's like, I want to talk to you. We're like, yes. She's like, I want to tell you sorry. Because I found out something after you guys, that what you have was very real. Very, very real. She goes, I had another boy that came in after yours that I had to deal with. And the difference was that boy passed away. She goes, and I got invited, and their parents were the same way. Read their Bibles, sang, prayed, had a church family, just like you guys. And they invited me to go to the funeral. And I went to that funeral. She goes, I sat in the back of that church. And I watched, if you watched our sons, she goes, I watched something similar to what we did. And she goes, I watched a church family, and I watched hundreds of people. They were sad, but there was something different. Because they were sad because they had a loss. But in the same time, they were happy because they knew where he was going, and they knew they got to see him again. And they knew what God had done through him and what they were doing in his life. And she goes, it was unlike any funeral I had ever been to. She goes, I went home, and for 3 days, I sat at my house, and I couldn't get that off my head. 3 days. She goes, I couldn't get it. I just couldn't break it. She goes, she goes, and the whole time I watched that, she goes, I was thinking about your son. She goes, and I finally one day I said, you know what, Lord? She goes, if that's what you do for people, she goes, that's what I want. And in her house, she got saved that a couple days later. And she came to us and she told us that story. She goes, I just want to say sorry. And I just want to say, I know the God that you know now. And I wish I had known him before. And she goes, and it changed my life completely. And she's a whole different doctor now from what we know. Changed everything about her. And it made the whole hospital mad. We made the whole hospital angry. We didn't care. But why? Because we knew the power of God. God was in our son's life. And that's one story, folks. My wife and I have dozens and dozens of stories. Nurses, doctors, moms, dads, other patients that got to see Christ and come to know Christ because of our son being in the hospital. And it's all on him. He told us he was called to preach when he was 8, 11. He wanted to be a preacher. How can you be a preacher when you can't say more than 6 words? Yeah. How can you be a preacher if you can't say more than 6 words? But I'll tell you this, one thing I've said. I think my sons preach louder and better than anybody I know. Because if there's the, they say like certain cities are the murder capital of the world per capita based on the amount of people that live in the city, right? I think per word said, per word spoken, he's probably had the most salvations than any pastor or preacher out there because he's never said a word, but his whole life has lived it. And that's what it is for us. We can do the same thing, guys. We can do the same thing. We can turn over areas of our lives that need to be turned over. We can remove rocks if we have to. We can take trees out of the way and get rid of the thistle and thorns. And we can get to that point where our seed can take root and actually produce. So I challenge you with that today. We're going to close. I'm going to challenge you with that before we go home. That you are the sower in this situation. And don't look at the seed so much. But look at yourself. And say, what do I have to do to become a better sower? What do I have to do to make my seed more efficient? Make it where it's actually growable. Where it actually takes root. And it affects those around me. So we have a piano player. So I'm going to close out in prayer, and I'll turn it over to you, sir. Okay. All right. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for the opportunity. We pray now as we come back tonight, Lord, that we can be excited to be in church again. Lord, just keep everybody safe. In Jesus' name, amen.